Hello everyone. In this episode, I'm going to be interviewing Professor Catherine Keller, the distinguished George T. Cobb Professor of Constructive Theology from Drew University. She is an influential voice in contemporary theology, renowned for her pioneering work at the intersection of process thought, eco-theology, and apophatic mysticism. Professor Keller's writings, including The Cloud of the Impossible and On the Mystery, explore the depth of relationality, the theology of unknowing, and the urgent spiritual and ecological challenges of our time. Her scholarship bridges theological tradition with philosophical and scientific discourse, offering transformative insights for both faith communities and intellectual circles. Let us first welcome our guests, and then I'll introduce the topic. Hello, Professor, and thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Hello, Rasoul. It's a real pleasure to join you in this cosmic medium, this instantaneous connection across our world. So I'm very, very pleased to enter into this conversation with you.
The pleasure is all mine. The majority of the videos on this channel and our interviews have been from Islamic perspective, and I think the audience will find it very interesting to have a conversation from a sister, or if you prefer, broader religious lens that is from Christian thought. Professor, before we introduce the topic, would you please introduce yourself and talk about your research and give us a bit of a background, please?
Well, thank you, Rasoul. And I'll just say a few things because the introductory things don't mean very much until the conversation has really begun. But as you said, I teach at Drew University, which is over in New Jersey. I live here on the 20th floor of a building in Manhattan, so I can take the train out to teach in New Jersey. And I've been doing that for almost 40 years. And that's quite a stretch. I might even retire this spring. That is a pleasure I actually kind of look forward to. So the work I've been doing, fits loosely under the heading of constructive theology, which is a concept that's a little bit different from systematic theology. I don't think either of those notions are very internalized within Muslim theological thinking. These are kind of Western categorizations of religious thought. But the notion of constructive theology has really helped me to flourish in the field, the notion of it and the practice of it, and the community of people around the world beginning to practice it over these decades, because doing constructive theology means that you understand that your own work is a part of the body, the always growing body of theology. And if it's not growing, well, what does that mean? It means it's dead. So this living, breathing corpus of theological work is something that one studies historically, and one studies it also systematically in terms of major doctrines and their organization with each other. But constructive theology has been a perspective that has allowed me to bring into play multidisciplinary perspectives more fully. For me, almost half a century ago, that meant bringing in my feminism. So late 1970s, early 80s. So the movement for women's equality, and especially in the churches, was important to me. And constructive theology could make a space for just thinking about how the gender metaphors of the church and of God work, and to remember that the metaphors are metaphors, and that if they are alive, they are also in a process that involves some growth and some change. So constructive theology allowed me that entry point as a woman, in a way that most women through history, of course, have never had, and so many still do not in my tradition and in our traditions. And I was very fortunate to be able to study with John Cobb, who was a leading theologian. He just died more or less at the end of last year, but it's not sad. He was ready to go. He was about to turn 100, and he did not really want to come to his 100th birthday. He felt 99 was great. But I was in good communication with him for decades. He was tremendously supportive in a time that just couldn't be presumed with the male supervisors, and they were all male. But I was able to work with him on what's called process theology, and that's a theology coming out of the broader philosophical background of Alfred North Whitehead, who was a great British mathematical physicist, or a mathematician who felt he needed to work out the cosmology of what was then very new in the late 20s and early 30s, quantum physics and relativity theory. And out of that rethinking of the universe, of the cosmos, from the macrocosm down to the microcosm of every electronic event, back up to the macrocosm, because they're all interrelated. This is the unfolding of a beautiful new worldview, so different from the standard Western mechanistic worldview associated first with Newton, where the universe is divided into separate subjects and objects, very Western metaphysical. So this was an alternative view of everything radically in relationship to its world, and always in a process of becoming, and God at the heart of this becoming, and encompassing it, all things in God, God in all things. So it was a meaningful theological cosmology that I was able to develop. So that's a whole lot of the content of what I think from as a model. And I was very fortunate that certain parts of the world here were beginning to open up, and I was able to find a really lovely teaching position at Drew University, which had one of the first women professors in a theological program who had retired before me. And I had met her in her retirement in California. But this is the other side of the country here. And so it was a very meaningful appointment. And I felt a lot of support from the men who were my colleagues, and very respectful support, and therefore the ability to do the teaching and the writing that I felt I had in me to do, and have been able to do that, and find colleagues and students, often they're all graduate students working either in the Master of Divinity program, often to become clergy people, or in the PhD program to become scholars. But with that community of discourse, I've been very fortunate to be able to, have thinking partners, have a community of shared concern who want to keep our Christian theology constantly enlivened with new encounters. And this conversation with you would be, a beautiful example of what this kind of theological environment wants to have happen. And so there's been a good sense of pluralism and of experimental adventure, at the same time held within a deep respect for the historical traditions from which we draw so many resources and so much inspiration, as well. So Rasoul, that's a lot, and I continue to do do some writing, and there are a few books out. There, I'm hoping might be more to come.
Thank you. Well, your area of research is really, really inspiring. And the first time I came across like your research, I was fascinated by the dynamic and interdisciplinary nature of your work. And that is crucial. We cannot just focus only on one angle, one area. That would be limiting. Can you please tell us about some of your favorite works?
I try not to be too much of a favoritrist with my books, like to be a good parent, you don't want to have a favorite. Right. And I do feel like I parent these books, give birth to them and help them get around out into the world. But I'm, of course, always attached to most recent books, but I'll just mention No Matter What, Crisis in the Spirit of Planetary Possibility, because it's just a year old. It's a set of essays, so it's not a monograph, but they're interrelated, and they're looking at the kind of ecological and political crisis that I think theology has to help us all in this country and in the world to face together. The book just before that was called Facing Apocalypse, Climate, Democracy, and Other Last Chances. That's my second book on the apocalypse. I'm not a biblical scholar. I don't get down into detail of the whole history of the scholarship of the interpretation of the book of Revelation. But I'm very interested in how that symbol of apocalypse works, how it gets used and very badly misused in a way that abuses so many of the human and other life forms on the planet. That is, when apocalypse is read as a kind of predictable end of the world, full of divine violence and punishment and all collapsing into the end. And then I'm just top down supernatural new creation. That's a very crude reading of the book of Revelation, but it's very common on the religious right wing of the United States, and it just gets around even into secular culture. And I think it helps to make people think that, the end is inevitable and it's coming soon. And so it helps to lead to really irresponsible United States policies, particularly in terms of our use of fossil fuels and our contributions to the compromising of the global atmosphere, and therefore to the warming of the planet. And of course, there's a lot of human on human violence that we have contributed to and continue to contribute to as well. So it's been important to me to mobilize Christian resources, not just for announcing, the beauty of peace and love of the neighbor, indeed love of the enemy. Of course, I love Jesus and I love to quote him, but that can become too limiting and too individualistic. So actually, theologically speaking, from within the Christian corpus, the book of Revelation is helpful for making one think also at the global level, and to realize how processes of greed and power merge together. That's what's called the beast and the great whore in the book of Revelation, the political and the economic superpowers of the world. They might be most effectively instantiated right now by two different American individuals, but I don't need to name names. The most powerful man, richest man, and that mating in the book of Revelation leads, of course, to internal conflict of a destructive sort, ultimately world-destroying. But the point is not that the world ends, it just goes through catastrophic breakdowns. And through those breakdowns, a new beginning becomes possible. So that was saying a lot about that book, and I don't want to do the same about another book. But if there's a favorite so far looking back, it's probably My Cloud of the Impossible, which was out in, that's 10 years ago that it came out. And its subtitle is Negative Theology and Planetary Entanglement. So I bring it up also because of your involvement in mysticism. And this book goes deeply into the tradition of what's called apophatic mysticism. I'm not sure how many technical terms to presume here, but the mysticism of unsaying, the spirituality that tunes to what cannot be captured in language or in images, that might call to us in language, might speak to us through multiple images and very finite experiences, but something of the infinite peeks through, breaks through. So negative theology is a tradition that's multi-religious, of course. There's something like it in all mystical traditions of the world, that awareness of the limitations of language. So I worked a lot with one particular mystic, apophatic mystic of the Christian tradition from the 15th century in that book. Again, it's not a book that is a historical theology, but it does a lot of meditation on that historical thinker, Nicholas of Cusa, with his combination of a radically new vision of the universe, a truly new cosmology of total interconnectedness, all connected in and through God. So it's an extraordinary vision, 500 years old, going on 600, and I think of great importance for helping our theologies to become more ecological, more mindful of the cosmos and of our particular delicate, increasingly fragile part of it, the Earth, but to call us to that responsibility. So that's the sense of planetary entanglement. And the negative theology addresses something much broader than ecological concerns. Really the mystical depth of all reality. So that was My Cloud of the Impossible. That phrase is a phrase of good old Nicholas of Cusa. So yeah, that was a bigger book than some of the others, and then the more recent ones, and takes a little more meditative time, I think, to read as it did to write. But it might be my favorite.
Thank you very much for giving us a tour. And these are very, very exciting topics because of many reasons, not the least of which is the interdisciplinary approach. And what is interesting is that what is first of all sad is that theology almost globally has been in many circles treated as a historic field, like some ancient years ago such and such happened and you're going to be repeating this and that, certain fixed things, and that is problematic. So religion in a sense is trapped in churches, in mosques, in other places and frameworks. And it is really important to take religion and matters of faith out of such context and reinterpret them in accordance with our time, showing the originality. Many people, especially from mystical and philosophical angles, have been doing this in Islamic world, like Professor Nasser. All the books you mentioned are amazing and quite exciting, but the work on apophatic theology is, I think, will be most familiar and relevant to this podcast's audience because of our mystical, because of the mystical orientation of the videos on this channel. So, with your permission, let's focus on that work. Before getting into our questions, would you please define to our audience what is meant by negative theology, by apophatic theology? What is meant by unknowing?
That sounds fun. So negative theology, simply defined, is a tradition of theology that emphasizes how what one says of God, one must also unsay. That is, one must realize that all of our human language about the divine is finite, and what we are talking about is the infinite itself. And so if we do not constantly remind ourselves and each other that our language is inadequate, it won't only be inadequate, it will be deceptive. It will carry a kind of arrogance, which is a problem in the tradition of Christian doctrine and the way it worked together with, of course, church power in the world and a kind of theocratic outreach, so that for over 1,000 years in Christianity, there was a strong development of a kind of power play, both in the leadership of the church and in the language, therefore in an overemphasis on what could be said as true. I mean, I think it's very important to try to speak as truly as we can. I'm really trying that every moment right now. But part of being honest, that is part of telling the truth, is recognizing, isn't it, how limited what it is that I can say is. Certainly about you. Well, of course, we hardly know each other. But even about my husband, who's just a few feet away, and after just about 30 years, there's still so much I do not know that I enjoy continuing to learn. But when we're talking about God, that unknowing itself is just about as infinite as God. And so negative theology puts into language the limitations of language, which makes it a particularly reflective, contemplative, sometimes poetic kind of language. But it has great meisters, the mystics like the early on Gregory Nazianzus and the Pseudo-Dionysius, who really developed strongly what the language of negative theology, a theology that negates itself. The Greek was apophasis, so apophatic theology. And then it plays various roles through the scholastic period. And in Cusa, we see it picked up in a very systematic way with his deducta ignorantia, of learned ignorance. That is, wisdom is to be learned in what you know you can't know, to be knowing what and that you don't know, to be really mindful of the limits of your knowledge. And what's so important, if I could just elaborate specifically a bit there with Cusa,
Yes.
or Cusanus, is, I mean, it's very interesting that he's ahead of Copernicus and Galileo. He's ahead by many decades. He's writing in the early 15th century. He's ahead of them in recognizing that the universe has no center, because the center is everywhere and therefore nowhere. And why is that true? Well, because it's the universe, not just the human, who is made in the image of God, the biblical imago Dei. So it's the whole universe made in God's image. For Cusa, which is an extraordinary cosmological breakthrough, and human beings play a very special, unique role in our being able to know that that reflectivity and to be conscious of the God relation. But because God is infinite, the universe made in the image of the infinite is not itself infinite. He doesn't say that. It is finite, but it doesn't have a boundary. And that's a paradox that's very close to where astrophysics is now. They can't say the universe is infinite. They say it might be a multiverse. There's no way of setting boundaries around it. So he was in an interesting way there. And with that understanding of the cosmos, there's an extraordinary cosmology that's already getting articulated, where everything is part of everything else. Everything takes part in everything, because everything is part of God, and God is part of everything. God is in all is in God. Everything has to be in God because God is the infinite. Therefore, there is no space that God can be limited from. So that meditation on the microcosm as containing the macrocosm is just an extraordinary cosmology, and it excited me to think through its connections, not just to a lot that goes on in quantum physics, but also the importance ecologically. So that's a kind of answer to how I got into Cusa's negative theology, because with all this intense breakthrough cosmology that would lead to modern science, it's so interesting that he's one of the strongest theologians saying that we don't truly know what we think we know, especially about God. So it's like this profound humility in human knowing is actually making possible immense breakthroughs of knowledge. And it's tragic that the West didn't pick up on the insight about everything interrelated with everything else. You know, we might not, as a civilization, be threatening a rather premature end of the habitable world by our irresponsible environmental practices if our civilization had been able to take seriously that interdependence and done so early enough, with all that it implies. So that's a lot about Cusa and that source of negative theology, because he's very, very profound in that writing. You know, he's talking, you know, and it's not just a vague unknowing. It's that what we know often just in terms of opposites. So he talks about the coincidentia oppositorum, the coinciding of opposites. So like the macrocosm and the microcosm, or like God and an atom of materiality. You know, like perhaps indeed, as he was beginning to articulate, like Christian and Muslim. I don't know if you know, he went on a visit to what we now call Turkey. And he came back with a copy of the Quran and was trying to get help reading it and understanding it before almost anyone. And he said with great clarity in a little book called De Pace Fides, The Peace of the Faith, that if we know what we know as Christians with any truth at all, we know how knowledge is limited and how our knowledge is limited. And therefore, we must know that we cannot say that other religions do not have truth. We cannot say that that would be a true claim. So that's a loose paraphrase of what he insists, and he comes at that from multiple angles, and there just was almost no one else making that kind of claim there in the 15th century. And again, it's tragic that didn't open up, but it did a little bit. But yeah, if God is in every electron in the universe, God was in a rather significant way, perhaps, in the Prophet Muhammad, and so on. So that's a hint of that 15th century voice of negative theology and the cloud of the impossible. It's a phrase, it's his paraphrase of a prior work that was anonymous called The Cloud of Unknowing. So he's deeply committed to that spiritual exploration of the boundaries of what we can know, not because we can then conquer the unknown, but because then that awareness will shed a kind of luminous darkness on what we think we know, and perhaps allow us to know more truthfully, more openly, more honestly.
Thank you very much. And lovely topic this is, and it resonates so much with Ibn Arabi's metaphysics. Like, first of all, Ibn Arabi is, as you know, very other tradition friendly. He's very respectful of other traditions, with Christianity and with others, pretty much like Rumi, with that universalist friendly mentality. But when it comes to all this apophatic discussion, Ibn Arabi is the king within this tradition. You know, in Islamic tradition, there is this prophetic saying, hadith, that one who knows their self knows their God, knows their Lord. So God knowledge is quite explicitly and directly tied to self-knowledge. And that has been very, very important point in Islam. And quite like Christianity, Islam also has that the human being as divine image mentality. The Quran says very explicitly that God, when he created Adam, he breathed his spirit into that form. What that breathing means, quite a technical discussion, not our focus here, but there is this mentality. So with this perspective, we are familiar, but then Ibn Arabi comes and turns everything upside down. The theologians and philosophers before Ibn Arabi read this in a positive sense. Know yourself, therefore you will know your Lord. Ibn Arabi came then and he said, sure, that's all good and true, but there's another side to it that you're missing. Do you know yourself? You don't know your nature and yourself fully. Therefore, you will never ever know God fully. And that is beautiful. He turned everything upside down. Sure, there is positive knowledge, but there's also negative knowledge. And both of them are quite important. So how do we know God? He says, walk through transcendence and immanence. That is, seeing God as a transcendental being, an immanent reality in the world. He says explicitly that walk through reason and what he calls imagination. That is his way of talking about the world of imagination, the world of symbols, where the corporeal take spiritual form and the purely spiritual, not having form realities take material form, and they interact. Here is literally the realm where the ineffable becomes speakable, where the ineffable takes form and we can understand and talk about it. And Ibn Arabi says walk between these two, both reason and imagination. And I think the audience of both traditions, both Christianity and Islam, would be interested to see how much resonation there is between the two thinkers.
Can I just interrupt, because it's in the book where I worked on Cusa at depth that I actually quote a poem from Ibn Arabi. Could
Amazing.
I read that poem? I just love it.
And sure, please. We'd love to hear that.
I haven't come back to this for a long time because it has everything to do with what you're referring to, the wonder, the love. So the poem reads this way: wonder, a garden among the flames. My heart can take on any form, a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, for the idols, sacred ground, was pretty radical, Kaaba for the circling pilgrims, the tables of the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran. My creed is love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is my belief, my faith. It's overwhelming, isn't it?
Beautiful, incredibly beautiful. And it is so interesting to see that such figures, such mystic figures from different traditions resonate so deeply. People like Meister Eckhart, like Cusa, like Ibn Arabi, like Rumi. When you read their works and their words, you don't see that strict distinction between the religions. And it is awe-inspiring. We talked about Ibn Arabi, so let me give you an example of that. It's awe-inspiring to see that Ibn Arabi says the ultimate knowledge is not knowledge. It is what in Arabic called hayra, bewilderment.
Hayra?
Yeah, hayra. Hayra, which literally means bewilderment, where you come to a point, starting with rationality, with theology, where you come to a point where you stand in bewilderment before and in front of the paradoxical nature of God. And he relates that directly with human paradoxical nature. Even you have a paradoxical nature. You're infinite dash finite. And that is exactly and precisely why the God knowledge reaches its apex through the human being, because other beings are not in such a they do not have such a paradoxical nature. Knowledge requires shared ground, commonality. We know this from Plotinus, and it is much bold there in Ibn Arabi's thought. So you have that shared aspect with God, that paradoxical nature in you and in God, and that's your common point. That's how you understand God, both in a positive sense and also in a negative, apophatic sense, and that is magnificent. Professor, in external aspects of religion, we have the do's and don'ts, and then we have all these different things in the internal aspect of religion. In Ibn Arabi, we said that he ties all this communication of ineffability, not all of it, but mostly to the world of imagination. The ineffable starts communicating with you, or you start receiving the ineffable. Even there, the form that you're receiving is not cannot be put into words directly. So Ibn Arabi says, look, that is the world of symbols. That is the world of images, where the truth, the ineffable truth, the spiritual truth comes to you through symbols And that's why symbolism is so central in Islam and many other traditions. So what things there, the truths there cannot be put so straightforward, in a straightforward way, not in a propositional sense. Things are not there like this Merriam-Webster dictionary entry definitions like way. So if you don't mind, can you please tell us a little bit about that mystical ineffability?
When the attention enters into the zone that we call mystical, it's already moving away from the objectifying, possessive kind of intellect that, thinks it knows, and that knowing is like an objective mirroring of the thing that it is knowing. So it becomes actually a kind of epistemic control here. And I think this is where the particular mysticism of radical interconnectivity is important here. And this is very explicit with Cusa. Knowing recognizes itself as a participation in the relations to the things that it is knowing. That is, knowledge is always already a relational knowledge. That is, it is an interdependence between the subject knowing, the object known. So I don't retain a kind of distanced objectivity. If I'm actually knowing something, it's participating in who I am, and I'm participating in it. And that so that it's as though the epistemology is already a kind of ecology. And again, it would have been a different history if the West had taken seriously that participatory character of knowledge, as opposed to the more Cartesian separation of subjects and objects that allow the subject to exercise control over the object. Knowing becomes a kind of mastery. That's how our disciplines, with their tight boundaries, have been functioning. You master the discipline, and it allows you to master some segment of the world, and you become an instrument for the political and economic masters of our nation and our planet. So yeah, there is an implicit ethic, at least in the mysticism, that combines unknowing with interdependence. I think when it's just a mysticism of unknowing alone, with no attention to relationship, the ethics is uncertain. It's unknowable, right? If you simply don't know, then maybe I don't know if I'm hurting you. How should I know? I don't know what your scream means. So there's a kind of unknowing that can allow great ethical indifference. But when unknowing is tucked in this way into our interdependence with everything else, then any kind of knowing that becomes available to us is disclosing our interdependence. And that interdependence, I think, more than anything else, calls forth ethical demeanor, more than just like be good, be virtuous. No, the reason you want to be good and be virtuous isn't just to get moral credit. It is also because you will experience the effects of your actions. You participate in a shared universe. So if you practice cruelty, then you will experience a certain cruelty back at you. I mean, you can develop, of course, great numbness to it that goes along with it. And that's its own kind of cruelty to yourself. So ethics, it seems to me, opens up only within attention to our interdependence, I mean, how we slaughter the animals that we then cook for dinner. Okay, I'm not saying everyone needs to be a vegetarian. Even I'm not. I do eat fish, not meat. But the point is, then if we're going to feed ourselves on non-human animals, how we raise them, how we treat them, and with what care and mercy we do slaughter them to keep the pain minimum, all matters. So that awareness of interdependence, our interdependence with what we eat, with who we relate to, with the world we move in, we breathe in, that interdependence is, I think, the kind of knowability that becomes vivid when we start to unknow our bounded, separative, Cartesian categories of knowledge, when we start to open knowledge into the interdependence of the very act of knowing. And then the other senses come into play, our awareness of our relationships to the whole come into play, and perhaps more ethics can come into play. So in that way, I think a spirituality of unknowing can teach both, of course, the humility. I mean, that's what it's first and foremost about. To recognize that there are limits to your knowledge means you should not act with great certainty. You might want to really check out what the effects will be. But when there's a knowledge of the interdependence, which is the context of all of our actions, then recognizing the limits of what we can know makes us much more attentive to the relationships which keep us connected, even when we don't know. I mean, you and I don't know very much about each other, and yet here we are, relating vibrantly, for instance. So there's a real connection to the ecology of nature and to a kind of mysticism of interrelatedness, isn't there?
Thank you very much for that answer. Very beautiful. In many traditions, we have a very important and central word, becoming. It's all over Ibn Arabi and Rumi's writings. But let's break it down to the audience who's not familiar with that word. They're gonna say, what does it even mean to say becoming? You either are or you are not. You either exist or you do not exist. There is this binary framework. So what does that becoming mean, they're gonna ask. And how can we relate that relationality to that becoming?
Yes, okay, becoming's relation to relationality itself. Coming out of the biblical tradition, I find it helpful to remind people that the very word Genesis is the Greek word for becoming. And people don't normally know that or care, but that therefore the stories of creation are stories of a becoming, a coming to be. But still, a lot of Christian theology treated Genesis as, just this one-time top-down act of creation, creation of this universe some number of thousands of years ago. There were different calculations, and it would last, a few more years or a few more thousand, or whatever. So that's a very limited sense of becoming that often was trapped there. And it's because becoming was subordinated to being. And that's the Greek philosophical tradition. Being, that is the sphere of timeless, changeless existence, like the pure forms in Plato, the abstractions that are the patterns of all that is, but what actually is, the creatures that are, they're always in a process of becoming, Genesis, but they come to be and they die. They come to be and they die. And before they die, they change. And Plato saw that as very secondary to changelessness. And the West really pushed hard in that direction with that dualism. So you have sort of changeless being, and then the becoming, that is the life of changes, seen as inferior. So I think that it's very important for actually retrieving the biblical tradition to think beyond that abstract Hellenic notion of changeless being. I mean, we in the Abrahamic traditions will go on having understandings of eternity and God's eternity, eternal life, and certain forms of absolute fidelity and self-consistency that can be called changelessness. But I think they need to be taken away from this static notion of a kind of changeless essence. That's a very mathematical sort of changelessness coming out of the Greek background, and instead to think about the dynamism of the creation in terms of its interrelated processes of becoming. Maybe that's what you are, an interrelated process of becoming. And right now, what we actually are is a couple of creatures who are becoming just a little bit other than what we were, half an hour ago, because of this interrelatedness. I mean, I'm still Catherine, you're still Rasoul, but there's a constant becoming if we awaken to it. So this is where I have loved that work of process theology that I mentioned in relation to my teacher, John Cobb, that comes, out of this book, Process and Reality by Alfred North Whitehead. Always near me, that book from the 20s, because it's really the great transmutation of the Western common sense of reality as made up of kind of essentially changeless substances with external or accidental relations to other substances. So, I'm basically the same as myself through time, and what's changing is external to who I essentially am. And so our relation doesn't really shift to I am. Because I am that I am. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. But this other view, this process philosophical and theological view, is that what you are, is a process of becoming. That Rasoul is a dynamic, live process of becoming. And to say that you're the same Rasoul as was born not many years ago compared to when Catherine was born, but is not literally the case. So the becoming, the Genesis, that is who you are, has its own kind of continuity. All of what you have experienced in the past is consciously and mostly unconsciously carried along in your present. That is your history. It's the history of everything you've been, and that takes in a whole lot of what your world has been and what your world has related to in terms of other environments and worlds. So that past is enormous that we become out of. And in process thought, it's moment by moment that you, Rasoul, become not someone completely different, of course not, in profound continuity with who you've been from birth, but you really are a present becoming now, and that present becoming now integrates within itself all that you have been. And mostly, of course, it's all unconsciously integrated. The unconscious is probably a vast collective unconscious, but it's that's all part of who each of us is. But in this way, we're in a constant process of becoming, and our relationships are feeding into that becoming in ways we can never completely control, but we can influence, and we can do that with respect and with gratitude and with care, or we can try to cut off the other relations or subject relations of a certain set to ourselves. So however we relate to our worlds and to our history, our process of becoming is a constantly relational process. And somehow, in the mystery of this creative universe, we keep coming to be who each of us is, moment by moment, with an extraordinary, lively kind of consistency in the very process of becoming. And it's not just humans, it's in some sense every creature that's in a process of relational becoming, at least in this process theology that I take awfully seriously.
This becoming, this relationality has been so central to my academic and practical life that it changed my life entirely. Becoming directly ties into ontology, into ethics, and more importantly, ontology, in the sense that what you read forms you. In other words, the book that you're reading does not just inform you, but it literally forms you. It does not just impart knowledge, it changes your very being. And that is awe-inspiring.
That's put magnificently. And you. Yeah, that is beautiful. That this becoming is happening, and we want to be very appreciative of it and mindful, not repress it, but also stay responsible in it, because it's the basis of our ability to respond to each other and to everything else. So we become in response.
A lovely conversation this was. I learned a lot. I enjoyed a lot. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to teach us, to have a conversation with us. If you have any final remarks, we'd be happy to listen to you.
Well, thank you. I have just really felt this conversation has been enlivening and soulful, so I appreciate it, and I'm hoping we can do it again someday. Take up the conversation where we've left off, even if it's been a year.
I'm very, very, very much happy to hear that, because I was going to invite you to help us again with another podcast, to teach us again. And I'm really happy to hear that.
Well, thank you. And I think I have now some energy for what is yet to become.
Professor, thank you very much for your participation, your insightful words, and would be honored to have you again in this show. I hope that you have a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.